Chapter 5. John awakened before the alarm went off and sat bolt upright in bed. It was opening morning, deer season, and the old ways had come back, the old excitement, at least for the moment. He kicked out from under the quilt and put his feet on the floor, the cold floor. John had an upstairs room without heating grates, and when the wood stove went down to a smolder in the kitchen, the upstairs cooled fast. He pulled on wool socks, thick ones his grandmother had knitted out of raw wool, and pulled his pants on over them with a scrape of cold cloth. He could see his breath. It must have dropped quite a bit during the night, and that's good, he thought. If it got down around 0 and there was new snow, it would be still and clear, and that was good for hunting. Downstairs he heard his grandmother moving about in the kitchen, and he smiled. It was 3 a.m, earlier than he normally got up, so he could do chores before he hit the woods, and it still didn't matter. He couldn't get ahead of her, even if he tried. She always got up first and put coffee on the stove and had the fire going before he made it to the kitchen. John pulled his shirt on and went downstairs, 2 steps at a time, but quietly because he knew his grandfather would still be asleep. He was sleeping later now and needing it. In the kitchen he was assailed by smells, the tang of the pine kindling in the wood stove cut above everything, but it was mixed with the soft smell of bread warming on the warming rack, and of raw potatoes frying with canned venison from the year before. "Good morning." John's mouth was watering. "Sure smells good in here." "Morning," his grandmother smiled. I'll have breakfast for you after chores." John went to the door and pulled on his jacket. Outside, he was met with a wall of cold. It was, he guessed, a little below 0. He could tell because the air in his nose froze and stuck together. But it felt colder because he'd just come out of a warm room. The rubber on his shoe pack stiffened, and the snow crunched as he walked to the barn in the dark. Inside the barn it was warm, as always, and he quickly fed the cows and scraped the gutters and went back to the house for the buckets and separator parts while the cows were eating. He was surprised to see his grandfather sitting at the table when he came back in. He was sipping a cup of hot coffee, the steam working up around his cheeks. "Good morning," John said. The old man nodded his greeting. "How are things in the barn?" "Fine. Calves are all right. Cows standing to milk. I fed silage and hay, grained the horses. I'm going back out to milk." "You go ahead and milk and separate. I'll take it after that so you can hit the woods." John hesitated. "Are you sure? There's plenty of time, and I can just as easily do it all." "No, it will gray up the east pretty soon, and you will want to be out by the swamp when it gets into light." John nodded. That was right. Hunt early, eat early, is what they said. Hunt late, stand and wait. "All right, if you're sure." "Absolutely, I'll be fine." John went back out to the barn with all the buckets and got to milking. It was still pitch dark, but some of the chickadees around the granary were starting to make morning sounds, and it spurred him a bit. Milking went well. Nobody kicked over any buckets or was froggy, hopping around, and he had got through it without problems. Also, hunting had entered his mind, and it kept him from thinking about his grandfather quite so much, took his thoughts away from bad things. When he finished separating the milk and cream, he carried the cream back to the house, and left the milk in buckets for the calves. He debated about feeding the calves, but his grandfather would have become angry and perhaps would have felt useless, and John didn't want that. Outside, the morning was coming. John stopped halfway to the house and looked to the east. Not enough light yet to hunt. Certainly he couldn't see the front sight on the rifle, but it was coming. He walked a little faster. Inside the kitchen, breakfast was on the table, and he smiled. It amazed him how his grandmother always knew when he was coming in to eat. He could be out in the fields with the tractor, have a breakdown, and walk in for a part, and there would be food on the table when he walked in the door. She always knew. She always knows everything, he thought. Just quietly always knows everything there is to know. John asked her one evening how she knew so much. They were sitting in the kitchen, just the two of them, and John had been asking about his parents. "I don't know that much about people," she said, flustering. But John could tell she was pleased by the question. I just try to know as much as I can about something before I talk about it. She'd gone on to tell John about his parents, facts about them, how they looked, how they acted under certain conditions. And when she was done, John knew his parents in one way, her way, but he knew that it was honest knowledge. When he thought of his grandmother, that's the word that came to mind, honest. She was honest and soft and gentle, an honest, soft, gentle person. He set the cream in the cool hole by the pump where it would stay cool, but not freeze, until they went into town later in the week to sell cream, and hung his jacket up. I could eat a wolf, he said, raw. His grandfather had been in the privy, and he came in. Set to food, I'll take care of the calves. John nodded, glad that he had not fed the calves himself. It would have been wrong to take the work away from his grandfather, like saying he couldn't do it somehow. Clay went out and John washed at the pump and sat at the table. In the middle was a pile of fresh, raw fried potatoes and strips of venison. He loaded his plate. There was also syrup, and he put some on the meat, sprinkled salt and pepper, and started eating. He had learned about syrup on meat from Emil. It had looked bad at first, but when he tried it, the taste was great, especially on a cold morning. I set some aside for sandwiches for you, so you don't have to save any. What about Grandpa? Oh, he's already had just set too. You can't hunt hungry, especially if you hunt long. She seemed different somehow, almost cheerful. Something he couldn't pin down, but definitely something new had slipped into her actions. The depression of the night before had vanished, almost as if a mist had left the house, and he ate heartily. Meat and potatoes with syrup was the best breakfast, better than pancakes any day, and he ate until he started to feel full and then stopped. Normally, he would have gone past full and had food for all day, but when you hunt, you want to hunt with a little edge on your belly. That's how his grandfather put it. Not hungry, but so the full feeling has worn off when you hit the woods. Makes it easier to see things, to shoot things. When he'd finished eating, John took his plate to the sink and kissed his grandmother on the cheek and went to the entryway. There he put his coat on and a scarf and a wool hat and wool mittens Agatha had knitted. She brought 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, which he slipped into his jacket pocket, and she handed him an apple with the other hand, a barrel apple from the basement, which he knew would be tangy and sweet at the same time. The rifle was in the rack by the door, and he took it down, as well as the box of shells from the shelf on the gun rack. John knew he wouldn't need the whole box, so he just took out 5 cartridges, brassy and shiny with copper bullets tipped in silver, and dipped them into the top of his jacket. He decided he would load in the woods. He waited. It's going to be all right. He thought about that and knew that she was wrong. It wasn't going to be all right. A part of him knew that his grandfather was going to end and be gone. But there was that small edge of hope in her voice, hope which she held the way a drowning person holds a stick. And John would not damage that hope, so he nodded and smiled. I know. I'll see you when I get back. Outside, the cold hit him again, harder because he'd been in and his body had gotten used to the warm kitchen and the warm food. He felt it come in around his cuffs past the mittens, around the back of his neck. By the barn he could see the glow from the lantern, and he thought of going to say goodbye to his grandfather, but he would be busy and it would bother him. Instead, John wheeled left off the porch and walked straight north from the house across the pasture until he came to the trees that marked the edge of the woods. Just inside the tree line, he stopped and loaded the rifle, sliding the cartridges into the side loading gate slowly, carefully. When all 5 were in the tube magazine, he worked the lever once and brought a shell up into the chamber. Then he let the hammer down to the safety half-cock and cradled the gun in the crook of his arm and paused, getting a feeling for the morning and the woods. It had stopped snowing, and there was a gray light from false dawn coming off the snow. It still wasn't light enough for hunting, but close, very close, and he knew that by the time he reached the edges of the great swamp there would be enough light to see the sights of the rifle. The woods were still. The new snow took down sound the way a blanket would, holding sound low and muffled, and with the freshness for tracking and the quiet, it was nearly a perfect morning for hunting deer. He turned his back on the farm and headed into the woods.